He smelled of copper rain and imminent death. When Nora grabbed the stranger by the collar of his ruined coat and slammed her mouth against his, it wasn't out of passion. It was blind, stupid panic. The mob wanted blood, and a lover's embrace was the only shield she could think of. She tasted split lip and ash, expecting a knife in her ribs. What she didn't expect was that the bleeding man beneath her was the Duke of Aylesbury. The air inside the Blind Beggar Tavern hung thick, a suffocating tapestry woven from the steam of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and the sharp medicinal reek of cheap gin. It was the kind of heat that stuck to the skin, damp and unyielding. Nora sat in the darkest corner, her back pressed against the weeping brickwork of the tavern wall. She picked absent-mindedly at a hardened callus on her thumb, a souvenir from the bookbinder's press. Her fingers were permanently stained with cheap black ink, a stark contrast against the pale, tired skin of her hands. She was exhausted, a bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion that made the chaotic noise of the tavern feel like a physical weight pressing against her skull. She just wanted her ale. She just wanted the rain outside to stop so she could walk the 3 blocks back to her drafty room without soaking through the soles of her worn boots. Then the heavy oak door of the tavern slammed open. The wind howled through the gap, carrying the smell of the open sewer outside, but the draft wasn't what silenced the room. It was the men who walked in. There were 5 of them. Dock workers by the look of their heavily muscled shoulders, and the tar permanently ground into their knuckles. At their center they dragged a man. Nora didn't pay attention at first. Fights were as common as rats in the ward. You kept your head down, you guarded your drink, and you didn't look the violence in the eye. But the sudden suffocating quiet of the tavern made the hair on her arms rise. The fiddler in the corner stopped mid-bow. The barmaid froze a sloshing pitcher suspended in her grip. They threw the man to the floor. He hit the sawdust with a dull, wet thud. He didn't belong here. Even covered in mud with a line of dark, thick blood crawling down the side of his face from his temple, it was obvious. His coat, though torn at the shoulder, was cut with a precision that didn't exist on this side of the river. His boots, scuffed and caked in filth, lacked the heavy iron nails of working men's footwear. Caught him down by the merchant's pier, spat the leader, a towering brute with a nose that had been broken so many times it resembled a lump of dough. His name was Cale. Nora knew him. Everyone knew Cale. He was the man you paid when you wanted someone's legs broken. Snooping around the crates, watching the ledgers. The stranger on the floor pushed himself up onto his elbows. His breath hitched a wet, rattling sound. He didn't speak. He just looked up at Cale, his eyes a pale, startling gray. "Magistrate's dog," someone muttered from the crowd. The word rippled through the tavern. Spy, dog, traitor. The ward survived on smuggling on the things that fell off the backs of carts and vanished into the fog. A spy for the Crown Magistrates wasn't just an enemy, he was an existential threat. The atmosphere in the room curdled. The ambient heat suddenly felt predatory. Men began to stand. Stools scraped against the wooden floorboards, a harsh grating sound that made Nora's teeth ache. "Empty his pockets," a voice yelled from the back. "See what he's written down?" Cale drove the toe of his heavy boot into the man's ribs. The stranger grunted a sharp exhalation of air and curled inward. He still didn't scream. That was his first mistake. In the ward, you had to scream. You had to show fear, beg offer money, offer your dignity. Silence was an insult. Silence meant you thought you were better than the men kicking you. Nora pressed herself harder against the brick. "Don't look. Don't look. Drink your ale." She wrapped her ink-stained fingers around her clay mug, but her knuckles were white. She hated this part of the city. She hated the mob. It was a mindless, multi-headed beast driven by gin and poverty, hungry for someone to punish for their miserable lives. Cale reached down and hauled the man up by the lapels of his ruined coat. The stranger swayed his legs, barely supporting him. A fresh rivulet of blood dripped from his chin, spotting the grimy collar of his shirt. "Who sent you, pretty boy?" Cale breathed, pulling a rusted, serrated blade from his belt. It wasn't a killing knife. It was a skinning knife. "You write down names, you write down the ships," The stranger blinked, trying to focus his pale eyes. His chest heaved. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a rasp, dry and cracking. "I have no idea what you're talking about." The accent. It was a fatal error. The vowels were too round, the consonants too sharp. It was the voice of the West End, the voice of silk sheets and roasted meats. The tavern erupted. "Cut him! Take his eyes! Throw him in the river!" The mob surged forward, a tightening noose. Cale pressed the flat of the rusted blade against the stranger's cheek. The man's jaw clenched. He looked past Cale, his eyes scanning the room, landing for a fleeting, terrible second on Nora. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a look of quiet, profound resignation. He knew he was going to die here on a sawdust floor smelling of stale beer. Nora's stomach twisted. A cold sweat broke out across her neck. She was a survivor. She had lived 24 years in the gutters of this city by minding her own business. She had walked past starving children, ignored the screams from dark alleyways, and kept her head down. Empathy was an expensive luxury she couldn't afford. But as Cal shifted his grip on the knife, angling the serrated edge toward the man's throat, a sudden blinding flash of anger ignited in Nora's chest. Not heroic anger. Cynical, exhausted anger. She was sick of the blood. She was sick of Cale acting like a king of the garbage heap. Before her brain could calculate the odds, before her sense of self-preservation could slam the brakes, her legs moved. She stood up. The stool clattered backward. "Get your filthy hands off my husband." The silence that followed wasn't the shocked quiet of a theater. It was the heavy, dangerous silence of a predator interrupted during a kill. Cale stopped the blade, hovering an inch from the stranger's carotid artery. The mob turned to look at her. 50 pairs of eyes, bloodshot and suspicious, locked onto Nora. She felt a tremor start in her knees. She locked them, forcing herself to walk forward. Every step felt like wading through thick mud. The air was suffocating. "What are you doing?" her mind screamed. "You're going to die with him." She pushed past a burly man who smelled of rotten fish, her face set in a mask of furious indignation. "Nora," Cale squinted at her, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What are you on about?" "This fancy sod is a magistrate's dog." "He's not a magistrate's dog, you brain-dead ox." Nora snapped, injecting every ounce of venom she possessed into her voice. She stepped right up to Cale, ignoring the rusted knife. "He's a lying, cheating, gambling piece of filth, and he's mine." The stranger was staring at her. Up close, he looked worse. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. He smelled of rain, old wool, and the sharp metallic tang of his own blood. "Look at his clothes, Nora," Cale growled, suspicious. "He ain't from around here. I bought him that coat with the money he stole from my strong box." She lied, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "He took my coin, dressed himself up like a lord, and spent 3 days in the opium dens while I'm slaving over the bindery press." She turned on the stranger. He was swaying, barely conscious, looking at her with a mixture of bewilderment and fading consciousness. If she hesitated, they were dead. If Cale saw the lie in her eyes, he would gut them both. She needed something visceral, something the mob couldn't question. Nora grabbed the lapels of his coat. The fabric was heavy, soaked through with dirty water. She yanked him downward, he was a good foot taller than her, and slammed her mouth against his. It was an awful kiss. There was no grace in it. Their teeth clashed hard enough to send a sharp jolt of pain up through her jaw. He tasted of dirt ash and the salty, warm iron of the blood trickling from his lip. She could feel the rigid tension in his shoulders, the sheer, startled shock of his body. He stiffened, trying to pull away instinctively, rejecting the assault. Nora dug her ink-stained fingers into his hair, gripping the back of his skull, forcing him to hold still. "Kiss me back, you idiot," she thought, frantically pressing her body against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering a wild, erratic bird trapped against his ribs. For a terrible, agonizing second, he remained rigid. Then, perhaps realizing that the woman assaulting him was the only thing standing between him and a rusted knife, his body went slack. He let his weight rest against her, a heavy, exhausted surrender. He didn't kiss her back, not really, but he stopped fighting. Nora broke the kiss, breathless, her chest heaving. She wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, smearing his blood across her own chin. Before he could speak, before he could ruin it, she slapped him. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the tavern. The stranger's head snapped to the side. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of a table. "You bastard!" Nora shrieked, perfectly mimicking the unhinged rage of a betrayed woman. 3 days. 3 days I've been looking for you in this cesspit, and I find you getting gutted over a misunderstanding. She turned back to Cale, breathing hard, pointing a shaking finger at the mob boss. "He's a thief, Cale, but he's my thief. You kill him. You pay me the 2 pounds he stole from me. You got 2 pounds, or..." Cale lowered the knife slightly. The mob's energy was dissipating, confused by the sudden domestic drama. A magistrate's spy was a threat. A cheating, gambling husband caught by a furious wife was just evening entertainment. The danger hadn't entirely passed, but the bloodlust had been punctured. "He talks funny," a man in the back muttered, though with less conviction than before. "He's from the north. He's an idiot, and he thinks talking posh makes him a gentleman." Nora fired back, grabbing the stranger by the arm. His bicep was rock solid beneath the ruined wool. "I'm taking him home, and if he ever comes back to the blind beggar, you have my permission to drown him." She didn't wait for Cale to agree. She yanked the stranger's arm, throwing his weight over her shoulder. He groaned a low sound of genuine agony, but his legs moved. "Come on, you pathetic excuse for a man," she muttered loudly. Under her breath, pressing her face close to his ear, she hissed, "Walk, or I'll kill you myself." They hobbled toward the door. The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly. The smell of wet wool and aggression brushed against her shoulders as she hauled him through the gauntlet. Every step was a tightrope walk over an abyss. If he collapsed, if he spoke in that crystalline accent, the illusion would shatter. Cale watched them go, his dark eyes narrowed. "Keep your dog on a leash, Nora." "Go to hell, Cale." She threw over her shoulder, kicking the heavy oak door open with her boot. The cold night air hit them like a physical blow. The rain was coming down in sheets of freezing deluge that instantly soaked through Nora's thin shawl. She dragged him around the corner out of sight of the tavern's dirty windows, slipping on the wet cobblestones. As soon as the shadows of the alleyway swallowed them, the stranger's knees buckled. The adrenaline that had kept him upright vanished. He collapsed, bringing Nora down with him, into the freezing muck of the alley. "Get up," Nora hissed, scrambling to her knees. Her dress was ruined, soaked in freezing puddle water and whatever offal the butchers had thrown out earlier that day. "You can't stop here. If they follow us..." The man didn't move. He lay on his side, one arm curled around his ribs. In the pale, watery light of a distant gas lamp, his face looked completely bloodless. "Hey." She shook his shoulder. "Hey." Nothing. Panic colder and sharper than the rain pierced her chest. She had just painted a target on her back for the worst men in the ward and for what A corpse. She grabbed him by the lapels and hauled him into a sitting position against the damp brick wall. He was incredibly heavy. Beneath the layers of mud and wet wool, his frame was dense with muscle. She patted his face. His skin was ice cold. "Don't do this. Wake up," she demanded, her voice losing its edge, cracking with fear. She needed to check his wounds. If Cale had stabbed him before she intervened, he would bleed out before morning. She unbuttoned the ruined wool coat, her stiff, freezing fingers fumbling with the horn buttons. She pulled the heavy fabric aside. Her breath caught. Beneath the destroyed outer coat, his waistcoat was made of a dark, subtle brocade silk that practically shimmered even in the dim light. And his shirt. Nora was a bookbinder, but she spent her evenings mending clothes for the working girls of the ward. She knew fabric. She knew the rough bite of cheap cotton and the scratch of sheep's wool. The fabric beneath her fingers was stark white linen. It was so fine, so impossibly soft, it felt like water against her calloused fingertips. It was the kind of fabric that cost more per yard than Nora earned in a year. Her hands froze against his chest. She looked down. On his right hand, previously obscured by mud, a heavy gold ring glinted. It wasn't a cheap bauble. It bore an intricate crest, a rampant lion over a crossed sword set deep into a dark onyx stone. A signet ring. Nora scrambled backward, her boots scraping violently against the cobblestones. Her heart felt like it was trying to crack her ribs open. He wasn't a magistrate's spy. He wasn't a merchant. "Oh, God," she whispered into the rain. "Oh, God, your nobility." The realization wasn't a relief. It was a death sentence. The nobility didn't venture into the ward unless they were looking for vices they couldn't buy in the West End. And when things went wrong, when a lord was mugged or killed, or simply inconvenienced, the Crown's guards didn't look for the guilty. They burned whole blocks of the slums to the ground just to make a point. If he died here, the ward would burn. If he was found alive in her company, she would hang for kidnapping or thievery. The man groaned. His head lolled to the side, and those pale gray eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, but slowly, painfully, they locked onto Nora's terrified face. He touched his bruised jaw, wincing slightly. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been in the tavern stripped of the breathless panic. It was cool, resonant, and dripping with an exhausted sort of authority. "I have been punched, stabbed, and thrown off a carriage this evening." He said his words precise and unhurried despite the rain pouring over his face. "But I believe that kiss was the most violent assault I have suffered thus far." Nora just stared at him, her chest heaving. The sheer audacity of the man. He was sitting in an alleyway smelling of rotting meat bleeding from the head, and he was critiquing her technique. "Who are you?" She demanded, her voice barely a harsh whisper. She didn't want to know. She desperately didn't want to know. He let his head fall back against the brick, closing his eyes as the rain washed the blood from his forehead. "My name is Arthur." "Arthur, what?" He opened one eye, looking at her with a strange, calculating stillness. He noted her ink-stained fingers, her soaked, threadbare dress, and the sheer terror radiating from her posture. He could lie. He probably should lie. But there was something deeply unyielding in the way this angry, desperate woman was looking at him. "Arthur Hastings," he replied softly. "Duke of Aylesbury." The title hit the wet alleyway like a physical object. Aylesbury. He wasn't just a lord. He was the king's cousin. He owned half the merchant fleet anchored in the harbor. Men bowed to him. Entire estates bent to his will. And she had just slapped him across the face and called him a pathetic excuse for a man in front of 50 dock workers. Nora closed her eyes. The cold was seeping into her bones, but all she felt was a sudden burning desire to walk away. She should leave him here. Let him freeze. Let the guards find him. "You're a dead man, Arthur Hastings," she said softly, opening her eyes. The Duke of Aylesbury offered a weak, grim smile, his teeth flashing white in the gloom. "I am aware, and it seems my furious little savior that by claiming me as your husband, you are now dead as well. Shall we walk, Paul?" The walk back to Nora's room was a brutal, staggering nightmare. 3 blocks in the ward wasn't a distance. It was a gauntlet. The rain had intensified into a freezing deluge, slicking the uneven cobblestones and turning the gutters into rushing rivers of filth. Every shadow looked like kale. Every scrape of a loose shutter sounded like a drawn blade. Arthur's arm was slung heavily over Nora's shoulders, his weight a crushing physical reality that ground her boots into the muck. He wasn't walking so much as letting his momentum carry him forward, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He was dying. Or at least he was bleeding enough that the difference was academic. "Keep moving." Nora gritted out her jaw, locked against the cold. Her shoulders screamed in protest. "I assure you," Arthur murmured, his voice a ghost of its former resonance, "I am not lingering for the scenery." Even half-conscious, the man was insufferable. They ducked into a narrow alley behind the cooper's yard, pressing themselves flat against the rotting wood of the barrels as a pair of drunken sailors stumbled past the mouth of the street. Nora could feel the heat radiating from Arthur's skin, a sudden alarming spike in temperature that contrasted violently with the freezing rain. His head drooped, resting against the crook of her neck. He smelled of sweat-wet earth, and that persistent, terrifying tang of blood. Don't go to sleep, she snapped, shoving her elbow into his ribs. He inhaled sharply, pulling away. Violence again. You are a remarkably consistent woman. And you are a dead weight. 2 more streets. They reached her tenement a lifetime later. It was a crumbling brick structure that leaned heavily to the left, as if exhausted by the sheer effort of standing. The front door hadn't locked in a decade. Getting him up the 3 flights of stairs was an exercise in pure agony. The wooden steps groaned in protest, slick with years of ground in dirt. By the second landing, Arthur's knees gave out entirely. He collapsed against the banister, his breath rattling in his chest. I cannot, he said simply. It wasn't a plea. It was a calm statement of biological fact. You can, and you will, Nora hissed, grabbing handfuls of his ruined coat. Panic flared in her chest again, hot and frantic. If he died on the landing, Mrs. Gable on the 2nd floor would find the body by dawn, and the constabulary would be tearing Nora's room apart by noon. Get up, Your Grace, or I will push you down the rest of the way and save Cale the trouble. Arthur looked at her through the gloom, a muscle feathered in his jaw. Slowly, agonizingly, he gripped the banister. His knuckles turned white. With a guttural sound that was mostly held back behind his teeth, he forced himself upright. Nora shoved her door open and kicked it shut behind them, throwing the iron bolt home with a resounding clack. It was pitch black inside. The air was stale-smelling of damp paper-rolled glue and the lingering scent of cabbage soup from 3 days ago. Nora dumped him onto the narrow cot shoved against the far wall. He hit the mattress with a heavy thud and lay utterly still. Nora leaned against the door, her lungs burning, her legs trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness press against her. You brought a duke into your room. The absurdity of it was suffocating. She was a bookbinder's assistant. She lived on pennies, ate stale bread, and owned 2 dresses. The man bleeding on her bed owned estates larger than the entire ward. He probably had servants whose sole job was to polish his boots. And now his blood was soaking into her only quilt. She forced herself to move. Her hands shook as she struck a match and lit the small, sputtering gas lamp on her work table. The yellow light spilled across the room, illuminating stacks of unbound pages, pots of hardened glue, and finally, the cot. Arthur lay exactly where she had dropped him. His eyes were closed. His face was the color of dirty chalk, save for the dark, bruising purple blooming across his jaw where she had slapped him. Nora walked over to the cot. She stood over him for a long, silent moment. She could just leave. She could pack a bag, take the few shillings she had hidden in the floorboards, and walk out into the rain. Go to the next town. Disappear. Arthur opened his eyes. They were clouded with pain, the pale gray darkened to the color of a winter storm. He looked at her, then looked at the sparse, freezing room. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for help. He just watched her, waiting for her to decide his fate. Nora cursed softly under her breath. She hated that look. It was the look of a man who fully expected to be abandoned. If you bleed to death on my mattress, I will drag your corpse back to the tavern myself, she muttered, turning away to fetch her wash basin. The water was freezing. Nora couldn't risk lighting the small coal stove. The smoke would draw attention, and she was nearly out of fuel anyway. She knelt beside the cot with a chipped tin basin of water, a ragged towel, and a bottle of gin so cheap it smelled like turpentine. Take the coat off, she ordered. Arthur struggled to lift his arms. His movements were slow, uncoordinated. With a heavy sigh, Nora pushed his hands away and leaned over him. She worked the heavy horn buttons of the overcoat, peeling the ruined, sodden wool off his shoulders. The fabric dropped to the floor with a wet, heavy smack. Next was the waistcoat, then the linen shirt. This was where she hesitated. The linen was soaked in blood down the entire left side, clinging to his skin. It was woven so finely, it felt like a sin to destroy it. She picked up her heavy fabric shears, the metal cold against her palm. She paused, the blade resting against the hem. Cut it, Arthur rasped, watching her face. I have others. Nora's jaw tightened. Good for you. She sliced upward. The expensive fabric gave way easily. She peeled the shirt back, baring his chest to the freezing draft of the room. Nora sucked in a sharp breath. It wasn't just a beating. Cale had gotten a knife in before Nora had intervened. A deep, jagged slice ran along his lower ribs on the left side. It was still weeping dark, sluggish blood. The edges of the wound were ragged, angry red against his pale skin. Surrounding the cut was a canvas of deep purple and yellow bruises, the result of heavy boots. He was incredibly fit. Beneath the bruising and the blood, his torso was corded with lean, hard muscle. He didn't have the soft, pampered body of the aristocrats Nora had seen riding in their carriages. His skin bore older, faded scars, a thin white line across his collarbone, a puckered mark near his shoulder. "You've been stabbed before." She noted, her voice flat, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. "Occupational hazard," he whispered. "You're a duke. Your occupation is sitting on velvet cushions and taxing my bread." A weak, hollow laugh escaped his chest, quickly dissolving into a grimace of pain. "A common misconception." "Hold still." Nora uncorked the gin. She didn't warn him. She didn't offer a soothing word. She just tipped the bottle and poured the harsh alcohol directly into the open gash. Arthur's reaction was instantaneous and violent. His back arched off the mattress. A sharp, animalistic hiss tore through his teeth, and his hands flew out, gripping the iron frame of the cot so hard the metal groaned. Every muscle in his body locked into rigid, agonizing tension. He didn't scream. Nora watched his face, her own stomach twisting at the raw display of pain, the muscles in his neck, strained veins pressing against the skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing reducing to sharp, jagged pants. "Breathe," she told him, her voice suddenly losing its harsh edge. It was an involuntary softening. "Just breathe." It took a full minute for his body to relax. When he finally opened his eyes, they were bright with unshed tears of pure physical shock. He looked at the gin bottle in her hand, then back up at her face. "Remind me," he gasped, his voice trembling, "never to invite you to pour the tea." Nora didn't smile. She took her sewing kit from the table. She selected a thick curved needle usually reserved for binding heavy leather spines and threaded it with thick black cotton thread. She knelt back down. "This is going to be worse." Arthur looked at the needle. He swallowed hard, the bob of his throat highly visible. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, turning his head away to stare at the peeling wallpaper. Nora clamped her jaw shut. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a second, grounding herself. She wasn't a surgeon. She was a girl who fixed books. But flesh was just a different kind of binding. "Keep the tension even. Don't pull too hard, or the material tears." She pierced the skin. Arthur flinched violently. A low, wretched groan vibrated in his chest. Nora's ink-stained fingers slipped on the blood, but she forced her grip to hold. She pulled the thick black thread through, tying off the first knot. "One," she whispered. She went in again. He bit down on his own lip, fresh blood welling up where she had hit him earlier. His body was a tight wire of agony beneath her hands. The intimacy of the act was suffocating. She was practically straddling his hip to get the right angle, her face inches from his chest. She could smell the gin, the copper of his blood, and the distinct clean scent of expensive soap that stubbornly clung to his skin beneath the grime. She could feel the erratic, terrifying race of his heart under her knuckles. "Who sent you down here?" she asked softly, trying to distract him as she pushed the needle through for the fourth time. "I was looking for a ledger." He grunted, his fingers digging into the mattress, ticking. "A ledger. You got gutted for a book." "A book with the names of men who are importing untaxed rifles." He gasped as she pulled the thread tight. "And storing them in the ward." Nora paused. The needle hovered above his flesh. Rifles. Smuggling silk or brandy was one thing. Smuggling weapons was treason. The Crown would execute anyone even adjacent to it. And Cale had it. "Cale? Guards it." Arthur turned his head to look at her. His face was inches from hers. The pain had stripped away the aristocratic distance. He looked entirely human, entirely desperate. Someone in the House of Lords is paying him. Nora finished the final stitch in silence. She tied the black thread off and snipped it with her teeth. She grabbed the ragged towel and wiped the excess blood from his ribs, her movements mechanical, detached. She had thought she was saving a man from a drunken mob. Instead, she had just inserted herself into a treasonous conspiracy involving the highest lords in the land and the most dangerous men in the slums. She tossed the bloody towel into the basin. "You're sleeping on the floor tomorrow," she said coldly. Dawn arrived not with sunlight, but with a gradual, miserable graying of the dirty window pane. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, dripping silence that was soon broken by the inevitable sounds of the ward waking up. The rattle of a rag-and-bone cart over the cobblestones, the distant, shrill argument of fishwives. Nora sat perfectly still in the hard wooden chair at her work table, her knees pulled up to her chest. She hadn't slept a wink. Her eyes were fixed on the cot. Arthur had succumbed to the fever around 3 in the morning. The stoicism he had clung to during the sewing had vanished, replaced by the ugly, thrashing reality of infection and blood loss. He had tossed his head side to side, muttering fragments of sentences in a language Nora recognized as French but couldn't understand. She had spent the night pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, fighting a rising tide of panic. If he died, what would she do with the body? She couldn't carry him down the stairs. She couldn't burn him. But as the gray light filled the room, the thrashing stopped. His breathing evened out, deepening into a rhythm that sounded more like sleep than unconsciousness. Nora slowly lowered her legs. Her joints popped stiff from the cold. She walked over to the cot. The heavy black stitches stood out starkly against his pale skin, a crude, ugly line of violence. The swelling around his jaw had worsened, turning his aristocratic features asymmetrical and brutal. Yet beneath the grime and the injuries, he still looked like he belonged on a coin, not a blood-stained mattress in the slums. He stirred. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. His eyelashes fluttered, and slowly the pale gray eyes opened. They were remarkably clear. The fever had broken. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, mapping the water stains and peeling plaster. Then he turned his head and found Nora standing over him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You didn't turn me in," he noted, his voice weak but perfectly lucid. "I considered it," Nora replied flatly. "But Cale saw my face. If I walked into a constabulary station to turn you over, the guards would arrest me for theft and Cale's men would burn my building down before nightfall." Arthur slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. He winced sharply, his hand going to his ribs. He looked down at the black, heavy thread holding his flesh together. "Leather-binding thread," he observed. "It's what I had. It won't snap. It is durable." He looked up at her. "You have my profound thanks, Nora." Hearing her name spoken in that accent with that quiet gravity sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She hated it. She hated how it made her feel seen. "Don't thank me. Just tell me how quickly you can walk down those stairs and out of my life." "That is complicated." Arthur swung his legs over the side of the cot. The blanket pooled around his waist. He gripped the edge of the mattress, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness hit him. "The men importing those rifles, they know who I am. They know I was close to the ledger. If I step out onto the street looking like this, I will not make it past the end of the block. Then send a message. You must have guards, a carriage, something. I cannot trust the constabulary. They are paid by the same men who pay Cale." Arthur looked at her, his expression hardening. The vulnerability of the night was gone. The Duke had returned. "I need you to deliver a letter." Nora laughed. It was a harsh scraping sound devoid of any humor. "Absolutely not." "Nora, no." She stepped back, shaking her head. "I saved your life because I was angry and stupid, but I'm not running errands for a duke and a treason plot. I'm a bookbinder. I make 2 shillings a week. I'm not getting hanged for you." Arthur watched her panic rise. He didn't push immediately. He let the silence stretch the cold air of the room, filling the space between them. "They saw your face," he said quietly. "I told Cale you were my husband, and Cale is not a fool. By noon, he will have realized that a man wearing a silk waistcoat is not married to a woman who binds books in the ward. He will start looking for you." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She knew he was right. Cale wasn't an idiot. He was just slow. The lie had bought them hours, not days. "I can hide," she whispered, though she knew it was a lie. There was no hiding from Cale in the ward. "You can run," Arthur corrected gently. "But how far will you get on 2 shillings a week, and what happens when the men funding Cale realize a slum girl can identify their enforcer?" He stood up. The effort cost him dearly. His face paled and a bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, but he forced himself to stand tall. He was imposing even half naked and stitched together with book thread. He closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. "I am offering you a way out, Nora." He reached out his fingers, brushing against the ink-stained skin of her wrist. The touch was agonizingly gentle. "Deliver 1 letter to my estate in the West End. Bring my men here, and I swear to you on my title on my life, you will never want for a shilling, a warm fire, or a safe room again." Nora stared at his hand on her wrist. The warmth of his skin contrasted sharply with the freezing air. It was a devil's bargain. If she walked out that door with a letter for the Duke of Aylesbury, she was crossing a line she could never uncross. She would cease to be a ghost in the slums. She would become a player in a game she didn't understand. But as she looked up into his pale, unyielding eyes, she realized the truth. She had already crossed the line the moment she kissed him. "Who do I take the letter to?" she asked, her voice cracking. Arthur's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "My brother, the man who ordered Cale to kill me." The parchment was folded twice sealed, not with the Duke's crested signet, but with a cheap dollop of brittle red wax Nora used to bind invoices. She had shoved it deep into her bodice, right against her skin. With every step she took away from the ward and toward the West End, the stiff edges of the paper dug into her sternum. It was a physical, scratchy reminder of the noose she was willingly slipping around her own neck. The transition between the two halves of the city wasn't a sudden line. It was a slow, agonizing gradient of wealth. Nora felt it in the soles of her worn boots. The treacherous, muck-filled trenches of the slums gradually gave way to flattened dirt roads, which hardened into crude cobblestones and finally smoothed out into wide, sweeping avenues paved with tightly fitted granite. The smells changed, too. The suffocating reek of the tanneries and open gutters thinned out, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of coal smoke from 1,000 chimney pots. Then came the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors, the smell of damp horsehair from passing carriages, and finally, as she breached the heart of the aristocratic district, the faint, sickeningly sweet perfume of flowering window boxes and polished carriage leather. Nora kept her head down, her thin, damp shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She felt exposed. In the ward, her frayed skirts and ink-stained knuckles were camouflage. Here passing women in pristine woolen walking dresses and men in crisp broadcloth, she was a walking contagion. She felt the heavy, suspicious glares of the patrolling constabulary sliding over her hunched shoulders like cold water. "You are a fool," her mind whispered a relentless, cynical drumbeat. "He is a duke. When this is over, he will throw you a handful of coins and let the magistrates sweep you away." Yet she kept walking. She told herself it was because Cale's men were already tearing the ward apart looking for her, but beneath the terror there was a bitter, irrational kernel of pride. Arthur had looked at her not as a servant, but as an accomplice. He had trusted her with the instrument of his revenge. The Hastings townhouse did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress dressed in pale sandstone. Wrought iron gates shaped like creeping ivy guarded a sweeping gravel driveway. 4 stories of towering glass windows stared blankly out at the street, their sills wiped entirely clean of the city's ubiquitous soot. Nora stopped across the street, hovering in the shadow of a haberdashery awning. Her stomach turned over a hard, nauseating roll. Arthur's instructions had been maddeningly precise. "Do not go to the front door. They will turn you away before you can speak. Go to the tradesman's entrance in the alley. Ask for Miller. Only Miller. He is the captain of my guard. If my brother Thomas has not yet dismissed him, Miller will read the letter. And if Thomas has dismissed him, Nora had asked, her hand shaking as she tied her shawl. Then burn the letter, Nora, and run as far from this city as your legs can carry you. She forced her feet to move. She crossed the wide avenue, dodging a lacquered carriage that rattled past with a sharp crack of the driver's whip. She slipped into the narrow, shadowed alley running alongside the Hastings estate. The smell of wealth persisted. Even here the garbage bin smelled of discarded lemons, roasted pheasant carcasses, and stale wine, a far cry from the rotting fish heads of her own alleyway. The tradesman's door was heavy oak bound in iron. Nora raised her fist and knocked a sharp, rapid rhythm that betrayed her racing heart. A moment later the door swung inward. A burly man in a heavy canvas apron stood in the frame, a crate of root vegetables resting on one massive hip. He looked Nora up and down his nose, wrinkling at the damp, sour smell of the ward clinging to her clothes. "Deliveries were done at dawn, girl. Off with you." "I am not a delivery," Nora said, forcing her voice to stop shaking. She channeled the harsh, unyielding tone she used on drunkards who stumbled into the bookbindery. "I need to speak to Captain Miller." The man frowned, shifting the crate. "The captain doesn't see street sweepers. Whatever you're begging for, take it to the parish." He moved to shut the door. Nora didn't think. The sheer, exhausting panic of the last 12 hours crystallized into a sharp spike of anger. She slammed the flat of her boot against the heavy oak door, jarring the man's shoulder and stopping the wood from closing. "I am not begging," she hissed, stepping into the doorway, her face inches from his. "I have a message for Captain Miller, and if you don't fetch him right now, and the man who sent me finds out you delayed it, he will have your skin stripped and used to bind his ledgers. Fetch him." The man blinked, taken aback by the sheer venom radiating from the small, bedraggled woman. He hesitated, then grunted. "Wait here." He disappeared into the dim, bustling warmth of the estate's kitchens. Nora stood in the cold alley, her breath pluming in the damp air. Her bravado vanished the second the man was out of sight, leaving her knees trembling violently. She reached into her bodice, her fingers brushing the stiff edge of the letter. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor inside. Heavy measured military boots. A man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, entirely lacking the soft edges of the West End aristocrats. He wore a dark blue uniform tunic devoid of medals but immaculately pressed. His hair was cropped brutally short, and a pale, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. He looked at Nora with eyes like chipped flint. "I am Miller," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Who are you?" "My name is Nora." She pulled the folded parchment from her dress, her ink-stained fingers trembling as she held it out. "I was told to give this to you, by a man with a gray coat and a very bad disposition." Miller's gaze snapped from her face to the paper. He didn't snatch it. He took it slowly, turning it over to inspect the cheap red wax. He broke the seal with his thumb and unfolded it. Nora watched his face. Arthur had told her the letter was a gamble. Thomas the brother had paid Cale to kill Arthur and secure a ledger detailing the smuggling of untaxed rifles. The letter she had carried was not a plea for help. Arthur had written it to look like a ransom demand from Cale himself, claiming the Duke was dead and offering to sell the ledger back to Thomas. Miller's eyes scanned the few lines of text. A muscle in his jaw flexed. He looked back up at Nora, his expression unreadable, a terrifying mask of professional violence. "Where did you get this?" he demanded quietly. "From the man who wrote it?" Nora lied smoothly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's in a room above the Blind Beggar Tavern in the ward. He said to tell you." She swallowed hard, remembering the specific phrase Arthur had drilled into her. "The hound has lost its collar." Miller's breath hitched. It was a microscopic reaction, but Nora saw it. It was a code. A verification that Arthur was alive, that the letter was a ruse, and that Miller was still his man. Before Miller could speak, a voice drifted down the stone corridor from the kitchens. A voice that sounded terrifyingly familiar. It had the same crystalline, arrogant vowels as Arthur's, but it lacked the low grounding resonance. It was thinner, crueler. Miller. What is the delay? Have the horses been saddled? A man stepped into the light of the hallway. He was dressed flawlessly in a dark green velvet morning coat, his cravat tied with geometric precision. He had Arthur's pale eyes, but where Arthur's were like a winter storm, this man's were like stagnant, freezing water. Lord Thomas Hastings. Thomas stopped, his gaze falling on Nora. His upper lip curled in immediate visceral disgust. What is this filth doing at my door? The air in the hallway turned to ice. Nora felt a primal, suffocating urge to bolt into the alley, to let the shadows swallow her. This was the man who had ordered his own brother gutted in a sawdust-covered tavern. He looked like a poet, but he smelled faintly of bay rum and raw ambition. Miller smoothly folded the parchment, slipping it into his tunic in one fluid motion. He didn't look at Thomas. He kept his eyes fixed on Nora, placing his broad frame subtly between the aristocrat and the door. A messenger from the ward, my lord. Miller said, his tone perfectly even devoid of any insubordination. It seems there has been a complication with your private investments. Thomas's pale eyes snapped to Miller. The disgust on his face morphed instantly into sharp, paranoid alertness. He stepped closer, ignoring the heavy scent of roasting mutton wafting from the kitchens, entirely focused on Nora. What complication? Thomas demanded softly. Nora's mind raced. Arthur had warned her this might happen. If Thomas intercepts, you play the greedy slum rat. Men like my brother only understand two currencies, fear and coin. Offer him greed, and he will not look for deception. Nora forced her shoulders to hunch further. She wrung her ink-stained hands together, looking down at the scuffed toes of Thomas's expensive leather boots. Cale sent me your lordship. She whined, pitching her voice a half-octave higher, injecting it with a desperate nasal greed. He says the job is done. The fancy man is dead. But Cale says the book you wanted, the ledger. It ain't where you said it would be. He says he needs the rest of his coin before he starts tearing the docks apart to find it. Thomas stared at her. The silence stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. Nora could hear her own pulse drumming frantically in her ears. If he saw through the performance, she wouldn't leave this alley alive. Dead, Thomas murmured, tasting the word. A flash of something relief triumph guilt flickered across his pale eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. He looked back at Nora with undisguised contempt. Kale is an incompetent butcher. I paid him to secure the ledger, not to leave it lost in the slums. He says he'll find it, Nora pressed, playing her part. But he wants his £50. He will get nothing until that book is in my hands. Thomas hissed, stepping closer. The smell of bay rum was overpowering, now nauseating. Tell that ape that if he does not deliver the ledger by midnight, I will send the constabulary into the ward to burn his little tavern to the ground. I ain't going back without coin, Nora retorted, forcing a stubborn, terrified edge into her voice. Cale will take it out on my hide if I come back empty-handed. Thomas sighed an exaggerated, theatrical sound of aristocratic weariness. He reached into his velvet coat, pulling out a heavy leather coin purse. He didn't hand it to her. He untied the strings, extracted a single glittering gold sovereign, and threw it onto the stone floor at Nora's feet. It hit the ground with a sharp, heavy clink, rolling slightly before stopping against her wet boot. For your silence and your swift return to whatever gutter spawned you, Thomas sneered. He turned to Miller. Captain, take 6 of your most trusted men. Ride to the ward immediately. Find Cale. If he has the ledger, secure it. If he doesn't, secure the area until he finds it. I want no loose ends. Miller bowed his head a fraction of an inch. Yes, my lord. And Miller. Thomas paused, looking back over his shoulder. His pale eyes were dead. Make sure my brother's body is disposed of quietly. The river will do. Nora's stomach clenched. The casual, administrative way he ordered the disposal of his own flesh and blood was chilling. It wasn't an act of passion. It was bookkeeping. Thomas turned and walked back down the corridor, his velvet coat swishing softly against his immaculate trousers. Nora stood frozen, staring at the gold coin on the floor. It was more money than she made in a month. It felt like a trap, radioactive and cursed. Miller moved. He stepped forward, his heavy boot pinning the gold coin to the stone floor. He looked down at Nora, the hard, flinty mask slipping just enough to reveal a burning, focused rage underneath. "He is alive," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the distant kitchens. Nora looked up into the captain's eyes. The cynical defensive shell she had worn for years cracked entirely. She wasn't playing a part anymore. She was just a tired woman who had stitched a man together with bookbinding thread. "He's bleeding out on my cot," Nora whispered back, her voice shaking violently. "Cale gutted him. I sewed him up, but he's burning with fever, and Cale's men are hunting us. If you don't come now, Thomas won't have to worry about the river." Miller's jaw locked. He didn't ask for details. He didn't question her. He simply nodded. "Wait at the end of the street. Do not let anyone see you. When a black carriage without a crest passes, step out." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned on his heel and marched down the corridor, bellowing orders to unseen men. Nora didn't pick up the gold coin. She left it trapped beneath the memory of Miller's boot turned and ran back into the freezing, rain-slicked alley. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now she just had to survive the snapping of the jaws. The ride back to the ward was a suffocating, silent nightmare. The black carriage possessed no windows, only small slatted vents that let in the biting cold and the smell of the city. Nora sat wedged between four massive, heavily armed men. They smelled of oiled leather pipe tobacco and gunpowder. Miller sat across from her, a loaded percussion revolver resting casually on his thigh. No one spoke. The tension in the carriage was a physical pressure, thick and heavy. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, the sound of the ward crashed in through the wooden walls. But it wasn't the usual cacophony of vendors and barking dogs. It was the sound of shouting, the sharp, frantic crash of breaking glass. Miller kicked the carriage door open before it fully stopped. Nora scrambled out behind him, her boots hitting the muck. She looked up at her tenement building. Her heart stopped. The front door had been smashed inward, hanging off one splintered hinge. Smoke, thick, oily, and smelling of burning rags, was pouring out of the ground floor windows. Cale's men had found them. They hadn't bothered to search quietly. They were smoking the building out like a rat's nest. "Top floor! The room on the left!" Nora screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the leaning brick structure. Miller didn't hesitate. He drew his revolver, raised his other hand, and signaled his men. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, a pack of wolves descending on a butcher's yard. They stormed the broken doorway, drawing heavy cavalry sabers and sidearms. Nora ran after them. She didn't know why. Every survival instinct she possessed told her to turn around to run into the maze of alleys and disappear. But the image of Arthur, feverish, stitched together, lying helplessly on her narrow cot, pulled her forward like a physical chain. The stairwell was a chaotic, choking hellscape. The smoke burned Nora's eyes, reducing her vision to a tear-streaked blur. The sound of violence echoed off the narrow brick walls, the heavy, wet thud of boots connecting with flesh, the sharp metallic clang of a saber parrying a rusted blade, the deafening roar of a revolver firing in close quarters. Nora scrambled up the stairs behind the guards, pressing her back against the damp plaster wall. On the second landing, she stepped over a man groaning in a pool of his own blood. It was one of Cale's dock workers, his leg shattered by a lead ball. She reached the third floor. The door to her room was gone. Through the haze of smoke and the dim yellow light of her sputtering gas lamp, she saw him. Arthur was not lying on the cot. He was standing. He had wrapped the ruined, blood-stained linen shirt tightly around his ribs, using it as a crude pressure bandage. His face was chalk white, dripping with sweat, his eyes glazed with fever and pain. But in his right hand he held the heavy cast-iron fire poker from Nora's small stove. Two of Cale's thugs were circling him. One held a heavy wooden club, the other a jagged butcher's knife. They looked confused, terrified by the sheer, unyielding grimness of the man who was supposed to be dead. "Take him down!" the man with the knife yelled, lunging forward. Arthur didn't retreat. With a guttural, agonizing roar that tore from his throat, he swung the iron poker. He moved with a brutal economic efficiency that had nothing to do with fencing and everything to do with street survival. The heavy iron cracked against the man's wrist. A sickening snap echoed over the shouting. The knife clattered to the floor. But the effort cost Arthur. His knees buckled. He fell heavily against Nora's work table, knocking over stacks of unbound paper and a pot of hardened glue. The black stitches on his side had torn. Fresh, bright red blood bloomed rapidly across the white linen. The second thug raised the wooden club, stepping in for the killing blow. Arthur couldn't lift his arm. He simply looked up at the descending wood, his pale eyes narrowing in defiant, exhausted fury. He didn't see Nora grab the heavy brass-bound book press from the floor. It weighed nearly 20 pounds. Nora hoisted it with both hands, her shoulder screaming in protest, and brought it down with all her strength against the back of the thug's skull. The man dropped like a stone, hitting the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. Nora dropped the press. She stood over the unconscious man, her chest heaving, her hands covered in ink and soot shaking violently. She looked at Arthur. Arthur stared back at her, his chest rising and falling in ragged, painful hitches. He looked from the man on the floor to the brass press and finally up to Nora's wild, terrified face. A slow, deeply genuine smile, one entirely devoid of aristocratic arrogance, broke through the pain on his face. "I believe," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, "that is the second time you have saved my life. You are making a habit of this, Nora." Before she could respond, Miller burst into the room, followed by two of his guards. They swept the room in seconds, securing the downed men. Miller saw Arthur leaning against the table, bleeding heavily. The captain holstered his weapon, stepping forward, and immediately taking the Duke's weight onto his own shoulder. "Your Grace," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion he refused to show. "The street is secure. We have a carriage waiting." Arthur nodded weakly. He looked around the ruined room. The cot was destroyed. Her papers were scattered, soaked in blood and water. The life she had scraped together penny by penny was gone, collateral damage in a war of lords. "Take her!" Arthur commanded, his grip on Miller's tunic tightening. He looked at Nora, his pale eyes burning with a sudden fierce intensity. "She comes with us." "I don't belong in the West End," Nora said, her voice cracking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, crushing exhaustion. "I am a bookbinder. I am nobody." Arthur pushed himself off Miller's shoulder, standing upright through sheer, impossible force of will. He crossed the small space between them, swaying slightly. He reached out, ignoring his own blood, and took her ink-stained face in both his hands. His thumbs brushed the soot from her cheekbones. The touch was grounding, heavy, and startlingly warm. "You are the woman who stood between a mob and a dying man," Arthur said, his voice dropping low, resonating in the quiet of the ruined room. "You are the woman who stitched me together with leather thread and walked into a lion's den with nothing but a folded piece of paper. You are not nobody, Nora, and you are never returning to this room." He didn't wait for her to argue. He didn't offer her a velvet-draped fairy tale. He offered her survival wrapped in the iron grip of a man who finally understood exactly what she was worth. Arthur's eyes fluttered, the fever finally winning the battle. He collapsed forward. Nora caught him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her face pressing into his shoulder, smelling the blood, the smoke, and the deep, enduring scent of the man beneath the title. She looked up at Miller, her own eyes hardening into a reflection of the captain's flinty resolve. "Help me carry him," she said. They walked out of the smoking tenement, leaving the ash and the ruins behind. Nora didn't look back. She stepped into the black carriage, pulling the bleeding Duke into the darkness with her. She didn't know what the West End held for a girl with ink on her hands, but as Arthur's heavy head rested against her shoulder, she knew one thing for certain: she was done hiding in the shadows. Nora thought saving a bleeding stranger in a sawdust-covered tavern was the most dangerous thing she could do. She was wrong. Surviving the violent mob of the ward was easy compared to surviving the velvet-draped snake pit of high society. She walked out of the slums with nothing but ink-stained fingers and a half-dead Duke, but the real war for her survival and her heart is just beginning. If you want to see how Nora navigates the deadly politics of the West End and turns a fake marriage into a terrifyingly real empire, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe. The next chapter drops soon.